Hey, good morning. We'll get started shortly. I'm just waiting for some other people to join. We're going to start the class at 11 a.m. New York Standard or Eastern Standard Time, but I'm out of New York City. Last time I had someone say they thought it was in Australia, and it's not the case. So we'll get started. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat if you're watching on Zoom or YouTube or through the Graphy site. Go ahead and ask any questions ahead of time. I'll probably just come back to them at the end, but during the session today, I'm just going to go over the basics of manual settings for your camera, the exposure triangle, as it's called, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, what they control in terms of how much light comes into your camera, the secondary controls that they have, and how they're supposed to work together. So it's just meant to be a basic introduction, but you're welcome to stay. It should be about 45 minutes, and then with a Q&A afterwards. Okay. Sweet. I should have like waiting music, like hold music while it's just me here waiting for people to join. Oh, sweet. Okay, hi. Thanks for joining. I'm waiting for a few more people to get started. If you guys have any questions, go ahead, type them into the chat. I'm probably going to get to the specific questions at the end of the spiel I planned. It should be about like 45 minutes, and then the Q&A afterwards. And I'm going to give it like 1 or 2 more minutes just to see if some more people pop on. This is being live streamed through YouTube. There will be a recording made available. And at the end, I will tell you how you can keep learning with me. I run a free Facebook group, and then there's some online courses if you're interested in joining. So I see I got a couple more people join now through the Zoom. Great. Like I said, we're going to get started in 1 or 2 more minutes. I just want to see if other people join. There will be a recording made available. And yeah, it should be about 45 minutes. I'll get to questions at the end, but anytime you have one, just pop it in the chat. I'd love it if you guys could say hi, tell me where you're from. I'll do an intro of myself as well. Basics. I'm Bridget. I'm living in New York right now. So, okay, perfect. It looks like a bunch of people are popping on. Okay. Okay, good morning. I am recording this class. I'm gonna record it through my video software, not through Zoom, so the warning won't pop up, but just so you know, I am recording it and it will be made available afterwards. I'm also gonna send you a PDF copy of all the visual slides that I used today. And I'm gonna send you links to ways that you can stay in touch. I run a free Facebook group that we do some challenges and just try to make a community of people who like to take photos for fun. And then I'm starting to offer some online classes that go a bit more in depth than just the 45 minutes that I'm going to do today. Any questions that you have, pop them in the chat as they come in. I'd love it if you guys could say hi, tell me your name, where you're from. And I will most likely get to all your questions at the end after I go through what I want to go through. Okay, so it looks like we got some decent group right now. I will introduce myself and then we'll move in. My name's Bridget. I've been a photographer for going on like 10 years now. In the last 8.5, I've been in New York City. Before that, I was studying photography. I got a degree down at Savannah College of Art and Design. And ever since I got out of school, I've been told to find a niche, to like find one type of photography that I should really hone in on and stick with. And I tried a lot of different types. I used to work and do music shows behind the scenes for music videos as well as artists. I did a lot of event photography, weddings, bar mitzvahs, portrait stuff. I've helped with, in front and behind the scenes of Fashion Week, as well as what else am I forgetting? Worked with small businesses for branding and professional headshots, and I've gotten some of my photos up in ads around the New York City transit system. So I've definitely tried a lot of different niches, and I can never just find one that I really liked. And I think for me, it's because I look at photography and I see it as a way to tell a story, which is prevalent across all genres of the medium, and a way to problem solve. It's a way for me to look at something, figure out what's the right exposure, what am I trying to say, what's the best image to get across the message or story idea that I want. So I don't really have one niche right now. What I'm trying to focus on is fine art, storytelling, and education. I just really like taking pictures, and I want to help other people learn how to take pictures and just enjoy creating. And I think one of the ways to do that is to kind of help everyone learn the basics and the basics of learning on manual. So that way you can get off auto and start making some more conscious decisions. So the intro that I'm going to go through of the exposure triangle, this could be like, a few weeks in a semester long course, right? And I'm just doing this as a brief introduction, and that's what it's supposed to be. So I'm hoping that you guys are gonna hear what we do today, hear what I talk about today, see the examples that I run, and know what questions to ask moving forward. I'm going to go over ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Those are the three parts of the exposure triangle. And they work together to balance your exposure, which in layman's terms is how much light is coming in, or how much light you're blocking in your camera. They all have secondary controls as well. They don't just control how much light is coming in and out. So ISO also controls your sensitivity to light and the noise or grain in a picture. Aperture really affects depth of field, and shutter speed controls how motion is portrayed in your image. So with that, I'm going to start off with ISO. I'm starting off with ISO because I learned on film, and what you do for your ISO on film is the actual sensitivity of the chemical coating, the emulsion on the film. So when you pick one roll of film, that's your ISO for the next 24 or 36 exposures on that roll. So I tend, when I'm shooting and when I'm making my settings, to go to ISO first, but I think that's just a carryover of learning on film, and you don't have to set this first, but it is what I'm gonna talk about and teach. So ISO is a shortened name for International Organization of Standards. You might hear it referred to as ESO or ISO or ISO. It's all the same. It's supposed to be an abbreviation for the International Organization of Standards that is standard internationally, right? So they can't have, the French saying iOS because they switch letters, etc. So it's internationally known as ISO. This is how sensitive your camera is starting off to for light, okay? So if you're in a really bright situation, like outside, noon, sun's up, you don't need as sensitive of an ISO because there's so much light. ISO is typically selected based on the environment that you're shooting. So if you're in a really bright area, you can have your ISO go lower. If you're in a really dark area, you want your ISO to go higher. I have the scale down at the bottom of the slide. 100 is the least sensitive, going up to 6400. That's the most sensitive on this scale. Your cameras may be able to go higher. Hold on. Let me just make sure. There's the chat. Perfect. Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to pull up the chat just so I can make sure I was seeing if there were any problems. Okay. And like I said, so more light, you don't need as high of an ISO. You can keep it closer to 100. Really dark, you need to push it higher, so closer to 32 or 6400. The secondary control of ISO is the noise, or kind of the grain. If you've seen like film grain, in digital it's noise. We call it noise. Cameras are a little different on how they handle ISO. In general, the relationship is the same. Closer to 100, the less grain, the less noise you're going to have. Every time you go higher, you're going to see a little bit more degradation like that. And again, certain brands, just based on the technology they have, the camera brands themselves will perform better in lower light. Like Sony has a processor of how they convert pixels on their sensor. They tend to perform better with higher ISO in low light situations than some other brands. But there are certain trade-offs. Okay. If you do start out with the right exposure, even on a high ISO, for most of our uses of photography, it's not going to matter if you have a lot of grain, right? If you are going to try commercial photography and you need a really, really clear, crisp image for a magazine print, if they still make those, or anything else that's going to be highly scrutinized, really close up, not a billboard, because no one's going to be close enough to a billboard to see your noise or your film grain, then you may need to make sure that your ISO is staying lower. But if you get the right exposure off the bat, anything going up on Instagram, Facebook, anything you're sharing in an album or printing like 5x7, 8x10, you shouldn't worry too much about creeping up your ISO as long as you're getting a good exposure in camera. So I'm going to quickly switch, and let's see if I turn on the light. Hold on. I'm going to go through a couple of demos, so you should be able to see my settings on the bottom of the screen for my camera right now. I just have this little guy, hello, set up over there, and a really quickly placed still life. So at the current settings now, the ISO is around 1600, and we'll see the picture pop up in a second of the current exposure. Boom, there it is. And overall, I think this is pretty good. We would call this neutral because it's as close to what we're seeing with our naked eye as we're gonna get. I don't think the shadows are too dark. I don't think the highlights are completely blown out, and I'm looking at that little gnome in the picture. There's some detail on that beard. So I think that's fine. Now I will just, to demonstrate, I'm going to change my ISO from 1600. I'm going to go down to 400. That's 2 stops, and I'll talk about stops later, but I'm going to go down now to 400 without changing any other settings. And now the new picture that's actually at 400 ISO is really dark, right? So that's the relationship. If I'm on completely manual and I move my ISO to a lower number, we're starting off with less light, right? The camera can't capture as much light starting off. Okay, that's the sensitivity that we're talking about. It's not as sensitive at a lower ISO, so it needs more light in the environment, in the scene, to activate the sensor. Make sense? Okay. Boop. All right, so the next one I'm going to talk about is shutter speed. And this is how long your camera is open for, or how long you're taking a picture. So for a DSLR, we have a physical shutter in front of the film or the sensor, right? And if we open, for the amount that it's open, the amount of time, light can pass through and hit the sensor and activate the pixels on there. If we have the shutter open for a really long period of time, more light can come in. If the shutter's open for a short amount of time, less light's going to come in, right? Relatively, compared to a faster or slower shutter speed. Typically, a shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So your camera might show you 500 as a shutter speed. It might show you 1000 as a shutter speed. It's really showing you that it's 1 over 500, right? It's written out like a fraction. So it's 1/500th of a second. It's 1/1000th of a second, etc., etc. The faster the shutter, the less light, and it's a shorter exposure time. So fast and short. If you hear me talk about that with shutter speed, those are talking about the same relativity. And slower shutter, more light, longer exposure time, okay? And this scale down here, I start at 1/1000th of a second, and it's going on full stops all the way down to 1/4 or 1/4 of a second. The secondary control of shutter speed is how motion is portrayed in your cameras. It's either going to be blurred or it's going to be frozen. If you use a shutter speed lower than 1/60th, and this is a rough guideline, you need to think about stabilizing your camera either on a tripod or putting it on a surface that's not going to move, like a table, a floor, a chair. If you use a car, just make sure the car's off, because if the car's on, the rumbling from the engine is going to make it shake. And the 1/60th shutter speed is, like I said, general. It's going to depend on a few things. If you have your focal length, if your focal length is really wide, you could probably even do a slower shutter speed handheld. Some people say your shutter speed should match your focal length. So if you're at 35 millimeters focal length, your shutter speed, the slowest you could do handheld is around 30 or 35. If you don't know, I understand this is the basics, so I'm not sure where everyone's starting. So focal length is how zoomed in or zoomed out you are. And your lens is typically, if you look at your lens, there's typically measurements for that. But if you have questions for that, we'll go on. I know I tend to drink a lot of coffee and I tend to be jittery. So I tend to keep a faster shutter speed because I don't want to zoom in and then just see around the edges like a little bit of out of focus or a little bit of that shake. So I know for me, I need to keep it higher. If you don't drink caffeine or just have a really steady hand, you might be able to go lower handheld. But the way to fix that is just throw it on a tripod if you got to go longer. All right, so before we move on to aperture, I'm going to demo shutter speed. So I'm going to turn on the fan for a second. It shouldn't be too bad with the mic here, but just bear with me for this demo if you hear that white noise in the background, okay? Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off I'm going to bring my ISO back to the 1600. We're going to take one more photo. So that way we're starting off with like a neutral exposure, right? So you can kind of see what's going on. And let's see. Yep, there it is. All right. So the little ribbons, those tassels tied onto the fan, right? If the fan's blowing, those things are moving. Now I'm at a 1/125th of a second. Those tassels are blowing so fast in the breeze that even that shutter speed can't freeze the motion. So we're getting a little bit of a blur. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my shutter speed up to 500. And I'm going to bring in some more light and some other settings. And let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to try to freeze the ribbons. I don't want to have that blur. I want them to be sharp, crisp, clean. There it is. Boom. All right. So you can see the difference a little bit. This is a fast shutter speed of 5/100th of a second. This is the slower shutter speed of 1/25th of a second, right? And we see the difference in the motion here. Okay. We can even see a little bit on the fan blades itself, but I think the ribbons are the ones really showing it. Now I'm going to go the complete opposite. Now I'm going to go really slow. I'm going to go down to 1/4 of a second. And I'm going to go down, we're going to step it down. Okay, so I just took another photo at 1/4 of a second. And look at that. The two strings up top that are actually getting blown, we can't even see them because they're moving so fast and the shutter was open for so long that we see maybe a tiny bit of the white of like those ghost marks here if we zoom in. But for the most part, we can't even tell that they're in the scene. Okay, so now I'm going to turn off the fan. Okay, fantastic. I hope that wasn't too bad in the mic. It didn't, the levels looked okay, but I apologize if that was rough. All right. Cool. So the last setting out of the exposure triangle is the aperture, and that's the opening size in the camera lens. So inside your lens, it's not in the camera, it's in the lens, the ones that you can change in and out. There's a diaphragm. And it could have, you know, it could have 3 blades, 5 blades, 11 blades. It depends on the manufacturer. But they're all kind of working together like this, where they can close down really, really tight, or they can open up really, really wide. Aperture is measured in increments called f-stops. And the larger the opening, the smaller number f-stop and vice versa. I'm not going to get into the math, but it's an f-stop because technically it's like a function equation. And the closer to 1, right, it's like a 1-to-1 ratio, right? So the closer to 1 that your f-stop is, the more of the lens is exposed and open, right? But if we're getting tiny, like maybe this is a f22, less of your lens is open for the light. So the light is forced to come through a tiny hole versus a large one. I know for me, I always got the relationship between it, like the f-stop numbers and how much light I was adding or subtracting, confused until I started thinking about how much light I was blocking. So if I want to block more light, I need to go higher. So I need an f8, f11, f16. If I want to block less light, I need f5.6, f28, f14. That helped me just kind of remember the relationship between how much light I'm getting and what f-stop I'm on. So hopefully that helps too. Unless you already knew all that, more power to you. Okay. Sweet. All right. Now the secondary control of aperture is the depth of field. Depth of field is characterized by shallow or deep, and it's what's in focus in your image essentially. So you can use the focus point on your camera. Usually it's like that little green box, right? You're looking through and you're setting that somewhere. That green box is actually picking a certain distance from your camera. So let's just say 10 feet. And anything that is 10 feet parallel to your camera, right? It's like, hey, this is the camera, and then this is 10 feet parallel. Anything that 10 feet parallel will be in focus. And it's depending on what your aperture is, from that 10 feet where you set your focus point, your depth of field will expand. A larger aperture is going to give you a shallower depth of field, whereas a smaller aperture, right? So think if f8's the middle, smaller aperture is like an 11, 16, 22. Larger aperture, if f8's the middle, is like 5.6, 3.5, 2.8. The larger aperture, shallower depth of field, less is in focus. Smaller aperture, deeper depth of field, more is in focus. Okay? And to demonstrate that, like I'm starting this last image with the really slow shutter speed. We're at an f10. So I'm just going to take an image again because the fan's off. We're at an f10, and what we should see at an f10, I should, just for continuity, I'll make it an 11. But what we should see at an f11 is that everything is pretty much in focus, or a lot of things are in focus. This is a still life that's pretty close to the camera. So I'm going to get pretty much everything in focus at f11. Right now, if I change my aperture from f11 and I change it down to f4, because that's the largest aperture I have on this lens. Let's see if we can tell the difference. What we should be able to see is that where I have placed the focus, we're starting to get some differentiation. So hold on, I'm gonna move the camera a little bit just so we get more of an obvious demonstration here. So for this next image, I've taken it at f4 and I've moved the camera down so an edge of the book is really, there we go, really close to us, right? So that's in an f4 aperture, and I focused on the page number, that 34. That's in focus, and everything kind of at that same distance is in focus. If we look at the back of the image, the background of the image, it's getting blurred. Now I'm going to switch back to that F11. And let's see when it pops up. We'll do some comparisons. Boom, look at that. So not just that 34 at the bottom of the page is in focus. Now we almost have the whole puzzle. The pen is also in focus. We start to go a little bit fuzzy on the cookies back there and the gnome. But as you can see, your depth of field expanded from like a tiny sliver at F4 to a bigger piece of the pie at F11. So I'll just hop through these, right? So this is F4, blurry, F11, right? And I'll zoom in. So this is F11 and this is F4. Okay. All right, sweet. So if you noticed, when I changed one setting, in order to keep the picture as bright or as dark as I wanted, right, to keep it at the exposure, I also needed to change my other settings. If we shoot on automatic on our camera, or if we're using our cell phone or something, the camera's kind of doing this for us. It's looking at a scene and it's using its internal tool called the light meter. And it is determining how much light needs to come in, how much light it needs to block, to get what the camera thinks is the neutral exposure, aka what we should be seeing with our eyes. If you use aperture priority on your camera, what you're telling your camera is, hey, I'm picking an aperture. You need to make the shutter speed and the ISO balance out so I can use this aperture. You're using shutter priority, then you're picking the shutter speed, camera's balancing out. If you're using program, it's usually called program, or auto ISO, no, program, where you're picking the ISO, pardon, then the camera is going to set your aperture and your shutter speed automatically. But your camera is just picking the settings based on how much light it wants to bring in. Okay, it doesn't know that you're taking pictures unless you set it up on some other menus. It doesn't know necessarily that you're taking pictures of a race car event or your kid's soccer game, which are really fast moving objects. Okay, it doesn't know that. And so if you're on aperture priority for that, it might pick a shutter speed that's too slow. And as we saw, your motion will be blurred. So when you're on manual, you can take control of that completely. I think using the priority settings like shutter or aperture, I think they're very helpful, and professionals use it all the time to make sure that they don't miss a shot. So if you want to keep doing that, keep doing that. But if you do want to take it a step further and set all of your own controls, you need to think about and start understanding the concept of stops. So these graphs up here that I have, these are full stops. And a full stop is going to double or half the amount of light that you have in your exposure. So going from 100 to 200 to 400 for ISO, right? Those are all full stops. So going from 100 to 200, you are doubling the sensitivity, right? So your picture is going to be twice as bright. Whereas if you go from 400 to 200, you're cutting it in half. Okay, so your picture is going to be half as dark. ISO and shutter speed kind of makes sense in terms of how their numbers relate to each other and the stops that we go through. Aperture is where it kind of gets weird. But it's still, this graph over here, those are the full stops. Your camera probably has more settings in between. Like it probably just doesn't jump from 1/60th of a shutter speed to 1/25th. There's probably 80, there might be 80 in there, 100, maybe 120 instead of 125. And those are called half or quarter stops, maybe even third stops. And that's fine. It's the same concept, right? So instead of going, completely doubling, you're only adding a third or a half the amount of light. Stop is like a relative measurement. One stop of light on your shutter speed scale is the same amount of light as one stop on your aperture ISO. So let's say I had an exposure that I really loved. I got a perfect exposure for a landscape, but I want to try and get a little bit of a shallower depth of field. So I want a bigger aperture, but I really like my exposure. Well, if I change my aperture, I have to change at least one of my other settings. So let's say I had started at 400 ISO, 1/25th of a second for shutter speed, and an aperture of 5.6. If I move my aperture from 5.6 to 2.8, I've moved it 2 stops. And I have added 2 stops of light through my aperture. So if I want the same exposure that I started out with here at these settings, I need to take away 2 stops of light somewhere else. So I can take that away on my shutter speed. Does that make sense? And this would also be, let's say, your priority was your shutter speed, right? Because you're going to a soccer game, you were just taking some portraits of the kids on the sidelines. Now you're taking portraits of the kids running around the field, and you need to freeze the action. Making your shutter speed faster, going from 1/25th to 500, that's going to cut out light. So you add it back in by opening your aperture. And yes, you can split the difference, the ISO is the same, etc. Before we get to that, so I'm going to do this again, and I'm going to go a little bit slower and talk about what I'm doing. So right now we have this at the f11, right? And as we've already talked about in the last demo, f11, pretty much everything is in focus. So let's say I wanted to get even sharper. Like, let's say I want the gnome and the cookies really sharp in focus, as well as the front. I still have at least 2 stops of aperture left on my lens. I can go from 11 to 16 and then to 22. Those are 2 full stops. So I cut out 2 full stops of light on the aperture. So if I just change the aperture and I don't adjust ISO or shutter speed, this is the result I'm going to get. It's going to be too dark. Now maybe you like that exposure, and that's fine. If I'm trying to balance it out and get that neutral, or the eye exposure essentially, I need that to be a little bit brighter. Okay, so I like this aperture. I need to add more light in. I can just focus on the shutter speed, but we're already pretty slow. We're at like 1/4 of a second, and I'm on a tripod, so it's not a big deal, but if I wanted to turn the fan on, I couldn't do that and keep the ribbons clean. So I'm going to change my ISO. I need to make it a little bit more sensitive. So I'm going to go from 400, I'm going to go 1 stop up to 8. I'm going to go 1 more stop up to 16. Right? And then it should bring us back to more of that neutral exposure, what we had. Right, but now at f22, come here. Right, these are more in focus, this part of the screen, versus this f4, or even this. Oh, is it changing? This is f22. Okay, this is F4, pardon. This is F4, completely blurred back there. This is F11, it's getting better. And this is F22, like we're really starting to see some details. Even though my focus point is at the front or the foreground. Make sense? Okay. Now you don't have to worry about making all those changes, right? I talk about this balance because I think it's something as an intro that I think it's important for us to know. And I think it's important for us to know about stops and think about that relationship between the settings. Like I said, you can use the priority settings on your camera where you're just picking one setting and your camera is doing the other work. It's absolutely fine. And I know for weddings, like I use that because there's a lot going on, and with crazy event and DJ lighting, I can't always be making all these manual changes on the fly. And there's a lot of other people who will use these priority settings to help them. So it's don't if you would rather do that than worry about your manual settings, great. Think about how you're composing the image, what you're choosing to include, etc. And that's really what, I think that's more important for photography than worrying about how proficient you are in the technical side. Okay. I do think it's good to know how they relate and know about stops and the balance. So if you guys are interested in kind of practicing, one exercise that I like to tell people to practice to really get down your aperture and depth of field is called ducks in a row. And the way you do that, you would pick different focal points in your image. It's really easy to see if you can get a bunch of the same objects, like this tray of colored pencils or crayons, or go find a fence with a bunch of posts. Because then you're really going to notice how your depth of field changes and how it spreads when you pick a different focal point. So if you focus on the closest and then do at least 3 different apertures, focus on the farthest, do 3 different apertures, and then in the middle, it'll hammer in the relationship between the focal plane, right? Or how much of the image is in focus, how that relates to where you set your focus in your camera, and how your aperture is going to change your depth of field. And as you do that, if you keep all your settings on manual, you're also going to get practice in balancing how much light's coming in with shutter and ISO. Panning and long exposure, I just think this is fun to practice with your slow shutter speeds or your fast shutter speeds. So if you, instead of blurring the object that's moving, try to move with the object, right? Pan with it, so that way your background's blurred. And you can try at different shutter speeds to see how much blur you get, because typically like motion's gonna, you need at least 2/50th, right? 250 for your shutter speed to freeze motion. But if something's going really fast, you might need to go higher to freeze that motion. Besides panning to get the background blurred with a moving subject, I think everyone should try long exposure at least once. Set up your camera on a tripod, open it up, set your shutter speed to really slow, like a second, maybe 2 seconds, and make sure you balance your other settings so that way you get the exposure you want. But just see what happens. Like, see if you can make something that's moving in the scene invisible, right? Completely, like have the shutter open so long and the other settings cutting out so much light, you can't even tell that someone walked through the picture. Really good thing to do with long exposure is go out at night and see how you can get the lights to change. And then the last one is, if you're interested in like actually going out and doing an activity, is ISO bingo. And this is a bit of reverse engineering, or it's trying to get you to think differently. So instead of going out into an environment and setting your camera based off of that environment, you're going to preset your camera. You can pick a square, So for example, the top right corner, the ISO is 400, the aperture is 2.8, and the shutter speed is 1000. You would set your camera to that, and then you would go out and not change your settings. And you will see like certain situations, your picture might be too bright or might be too dark. I think it's fun because it's limiting you. And I think anytime you limit yourself, you start to learn differently. And you'll find what situations these settings would work for. And it'll help you for the future when you go into situations. You can be like, hey, what worked really well was that really fast shutter speed for this scenario. I'm going to pull it up, and I think these other settings would work well since it's so bright. Or, the settings that I use, they were just a touch dark. So I'm going to adjust it this way for next time. Oh, that makes sense. All right, cool. So I saw that there was a couple of Q&As, so I'm going to get to that now. But thank you for sitting through this. Thank you for giving up. It's a Saturday morning for me, so thank you for everyone else this is a Saturday morning, Saturday evening. I know it's tough sometimes. I would love it if you guys could stay in touch in the email when I send out the link to the recording and the presentation slides. I'll give you a link to the Imperfect Photography Facebook group. It's a group of people who like to take photos. We share at least once a week on Photo Friday, like what we've been doing. Right now for Halloween, we're kind of running a tutorials contest. So I'm posting tutorials and people are trying to copy and share their results. And I also have an online course. It's pretty new. I'm going to send a discount code to you guys in the email. But it's on learn.bhaggerty.com. And one chapter is this. It's the photo basics, the exposure triangle, but I do touch on a little bit of photo editing, like real basics intro. Also, we go through, there's some video of me like going out and shooting on location with a portrait. And then there's more talk about composition in photography, really basic intro to lighting, really just like a touchstone. So even if you go through the videos, go through the course, it's about 5 hours-ish, you can leave with a better understanding and also more questions to go forward and keep learning. But I'll send everyone info about that in the follow-up with the recording. Okay, and let me just get over here, okay, to the Q&A. Okay, sweet. Chat area. Chat is disabled. Wow, that's exciting. Okay, a couple people said the chat's disabled. So let me see, let me just make sure. It should be up. But I'll see if I can avoid it. Bum, 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 ba-dum. All right, hi Bonnie. Thank you for saying hi. Glad you can join us from Oregon. That's pretty early, isn't it? Like 8 a.m. Good for you. I'm sorry you couldn't post anything in the chat, but thanks for reaching out for the Q&A. I'll see if I can open this. But if anyone does have questions, you can use the Q&A feature. I'll try to, let me see that. Hopefully that's it now. It should be. Attendees can chat with everyone. All right, this should work now. My apologies for that. And yeah, someone else had a question about the chat being disabled. So I'm sorry for that. I didn't realize everything else was all set up. But I guess that's good. There's always something that goes wrong in like the 5 minutes before the class starts. And today I had one thing go wrong and it was a really quick fix. So the chat was just the second thing that I missed. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how often. Hi, Texas. Hi, Lauren. Laureen. Laureen. Doesn't matter. Um, but yeah, it was, yeah, every time, even if I set up like the night before and I don't touch anything and it all works, and then the morning comes and something happened. Um, so we just plan for that now. Great. Okay. I'm going to check over. It doesn't look like anyone in Zoom. That's cute. Okay. We're going to remove a couple of weird comments. Awesome. And good morning, William from Canada. Oh, God. The stream on YouTube is really not good quality. That's fine. Next time I'll fix it. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any questions over there, but yeah, I'll definitely send out. Awesome, cool. I'm glad the examples helped, Mark. Yeah, I think that's usually what people say they like the most out of these, you know? Okay, awesome. Okay, so we got a question from Lorraine in relation to shutter speed. Okay, what is the easiest way to remember various speeds to use? Good question. I would say some rules of thumb are anything over higher than 60, you can do handheld. Anything lower than that, so 30, etc., 30, 15, etc., you want a tripod or something to stabilize it. And then in terms of freezing motion, the the amount of time that a subject can travel across the frame, right across the picture plane, that's what's causing it to either blur or to be frozen. So if you need to freeze the action, if something's going really fast, you probably need over 500 because you're trying to just capture it at that sliver. This probably isn't easy, but it's a more explanation. I think anything over 500 or higher is really going to freeze the action, right? So 500 or higher, it's really going to freeze the action. And then remembering that anytime you go on a shutter speed that's slower than 1/60th, be mindful you may need to stabilize. So I think those are the two like really quick tips to remember that'll help you. But if you want to really like understand motion blur, if I have my shutter open for, let's say, 1 second, and it takes a person 1 second to cross the screen, well, for every second, well, for every like microsecond, the light is bouncing off of that person moving, right? So we're going to get a bit more of an exposure because of how slow the subject's moving and how long I have my shutter open. If my subject only takes, like 1/100th of a second to cross the frame, but I'm open for a whole second, that exposure that is really, it's kind of chopping up the subject moving across the frame. This is probably more confusing for you, so I'm going to stop talking. But does that make sense? Like if the amount of light bouncing off the subject as it moves through your picture plane, that's what's causing a motion blur. So if it goes really, really fast, the light doesn't have enough time to bounce off it and hit your sensor. If it's going slow or it's still, the light has more time to bounce off it. It's bouncing off more and giving more of a reflection into your camera. But I think the simple way, like you asked for, anything slower than 1/60th, be prepared. You may need to stabilize it if you want to freeze motion to 250, but really 500 or faster. And I hope that helped summarize it for you. Okay. Awesome. Great. Fantastic. Okay, looks like I'm glad that helped, Lorraine. Awesome. Bonnie, I'm glad. Yes, I'm definitely going to give you guys the recording. And I'm still recording these Q&As, so that'll be included in it too. Right? Let me just make sure I didn't accidentally. Yeah, perfect. Okay, I will hang out for a couple more minutes if you guys think of anything, or if you have questions outside of this course, happy to answer. But yeah, all right. Yes, someone just asked if you can print the slides for the class. Yes, absolutely fine. This is free. This particular session was free, so if you share it with other people, I'm fine with that. Yeah, if you do the course that I have online, there is a fee attached to it. So obviously anything in there that's not covered in this free class, I would appreciate if you could just keep to yourself, but it's the internet. Can't be too picky. Awesome. All right. Cool. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. I'll hang out 1 or 2 more minutes if you have any questions. Otherwise, just look out for the email from me. It'll be from Bridget@bhaggerty.com, and it'll have the link to the recording. As the slide should be attached, etc. Okay, someone has a question about if there are any phone cameras that allow manual control. There are apps you can download. I actually have Lightroom on my phone, and through the mobile app, there's a setting you can take pictures, and it will allow you to manually set your settings. You can set your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And there was also I happened to find by what are we talking about? I just happened to find by Googling or searching in my app store manual camera settings, and it was a free one. And I think it's literally just called manual camera. And I was able to change settings in there. I was also able to change white balance, which is something I didn't get to today, but you're also able to change that.